Kushner and congressional staffers. Yep, it was a working group day over at the Eisenhower Executive Office building. By the way, today's meeting follows that, I guess you could call it a contentious Situation Room gathering yesterday. The president said it was productive. The speaker, Nancy Pelosi, said, listen, it was contentious. Both sides agreed it certainly was not easy. Now, asked if he thought the president might be willing to, move toward the Democrats' demands in order to restart the government, Hogan Gidley said no.
He's not moving because he's not going to sacrifice the safety and the security of the American people. That is something he will not compromise on. How the final bill looks, I'm not going to negotiate here from this seat, but the president demands enough money, enough funding to protect the American people.
Protecting the American people, that is the cornerstone of this argument, the need for a wall, that and the safety and security of our officials who work on the border. We're talking about ICE, DHS folks, and obviously the Border Patrol. By the way, I should also let you know that we have it from Sarah Sanders, the White House press secretary, that the president will be making his way to Camp David tomorrow. It's a sure bet they'll be talking about the 2019 agenda and indeed looking for a way to end this now protracted partial shutdown, which is into its 15th day. Laura?
All right, Kevin Corke for us live at the White House. No such thing as a slow news day on the weekends,
no
that's
doubt.
for sure. All right, Kevin, thank you. Eric?
Thank you.
I did say that. Absolutely, I said that. I don't think it will, but I am prepared, and I think I can speak for Republicans in the House and Republicans in the Senate. They feel very strongly about having a safe country, having a border that makes sense without borders. I've said it many times, we don't have a country. I hope it doesn't go on even beyond a few more days. It really could open very quickly. I told them that bring who you want. We have 3 people. You can ideally bring 3, but you can bring 6, you can bring 9, you can bring 12. And they're going to be working over the weekend. I think it may have been somewhat contentious, but I think it was very productive.
Well, that's President Trump, of course, yesterday confirming that he told Democratic Minority Leader Senator Chuck Schumer that he is prepared to keep the shutdown going for what he claimed, or months or even years, though the latter is doubtful. And as he raises the possibility of invoking presidential powers to declare a national emergency in order to get that wall built, what are those powers invested in the chief executive? And does the president really have to wait for Congress to fund it, something the Democratic House is refusing to do? Our first guest attended yesterday's Rose Garden news conference. He is Reuters White House correspondent Jeff Mason. And Jeff joins us, as you can see, from the north lawn of the White House right now. So, Jeff, let's start with a national emergency. What would it mean if the president, for the purposes of building this wall, would declare a national emergency?
Well, number one, it would mean that the president would invoke certain powers that he believes would allow him to go around Congress and not require their approval for funding for the wall. How exactly that would work is not entirely clear. Previous presidents have used emergency powers or declared a national emergency during times of war. Clearly, that's something that the president is thinking about because he addressed it in that press conference yesterday. But how exactly it would work, I'm not in a position to say.
Yeah, I mean, they've also been used for economic issues, for oil and for other supports and price supports and this sort of thing. Let's take a look at 2 points of the law, as has been pointed out, that gives the president this type of power. 10 U.S.C. 284 basically directs the defense secretary to, quote, provide support for the counter-drug activities or activities to counter transnational organized crime of any department or agency of the federal government. Then there's a U.S.C. 2808. The Secretary of Defense, without regard to any other provision of the law, may undertake military construction projects and may authorize the secretaries of the military departments to undertake military construction projects. Such projects may be undertaken only within the total amount of funds that have been appropriated for military construction. So, Jeff, would that possibly mean if they have $1 to $2 billion, it's believed, in military outlays that they already have in hand for construction, the president has the power to move that $2 billion from whatever projects they have on military bases to the wall?
Well, that's a good question, and it would be in line with what the president has said before, which is that he might use military funding for that. He has certainly envisioned a role for the military at the border and could do so with the wall and in finding the money to pay for that wall. Again, this was his really big campaign promise, primary significant campaign promise from 2016. We're about 2 years into his presidency right now, and he's clearly drawing a line in the sand and saying, I'm willing to do anything I have to do to make sure I get that, whether it's through negotiations with Democrats and Republicans from the Hill or through extraordinary measures.
And if he does take that extraordinary measure, it would likely be challenged in court. And also, critics are saying, it's autocratic, it's like a dictatorship. It certainly would be like almost a threat to democracy. I mean, does that hold any water, or is it's in the presidential powers?
Well, it would almost certainly be challenged in court. You're absolutely right about that. And, the people who are very passionate about having this wall, including the president and his staff and people around him, are matched by the people who are equally passionate about not having it. And both sides would work very hard either to get it or to prevent it if the president were to try to use presidential powers to make it happen.
Meanwhile, I've had several meetings, one in the Situation Room and others. Certainly the telephone lines are burning up, and we just had the meeting wrapping up a moments ago at the Old Executive Office building next to you.
That's right.
What happened, and what do you think will come out of it?
Well, we're not sure what's happened because no one has, at least the White House officials I've reached out to, haven't come back with any particular details on it yet. We saw who was involved in the meeting, Vice President Pence leading those talks, as well as the acting Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, Jared Kushner also along. From the congressional side, there were congressional aides. And so it's unclear. It's also not clear if they're coming back today or if they were just breaking for lunch or if they're done for the day. Bottom line is, if they're going to find a compromise, we expect it to be somewhere between that $1.3 billion that Democrats have already offered for border funding versus the $5.6 billion that the President Trump says he needs to build that wall. Whether or not they're able to find a compromise on that figure, somewhere in between, that's the million-dollar question, or the multi-billion-dollar question right now.
Exactly. I mean, what do you think will happen? How can it thread that needle? I mean, the Democrats, they say, well, it's a fence. They don't want a wall. Or the president can then claim whatever it is, the barriers with the slats, that would be a wall. Here we're showing video right now with the vice president, followed by Jared Kushner there, leaving that meeting, obviously, in some discussions. Jeff, how do you think this will end? Because it's got to.
Yeah, and I wish I knew the answer to that. I think that they will continue to talk. There's no question about that. Both sides have said they don't want the government to be shut down, but the president, of course, saying that it could stay shut down as long as years. He's only got 2 years left in his term. I think it's pretty hard to imagine that the government would stay shut down that long. But that's his way of saying, I'm really serious about this. Democrats, on the other hand, are serious about it as well. Nancy Pelosi has just become Speaker of the House, and she and her caucus don't have an incentive to change what they think is a critical issue, and that is to not give funding to this wall, which, as she has said in the last few days, she does not consider a moral issue.
Oh, something's got to give, and we'll see what that is. Jeff, always good to see you. Thank you for joining us outside today on the
My
North
pleasure.
Lawn, of course. Laura?
And a very busy week in Washington went on. The 116th Congress was sworn in this week. It includes a record number of women and members with diverse backgrounds. Now, some of the new faces have wasted no time in making their voices heard. Garrett Tenney has more on this from Washington.
The freshman class of this Congress includes a wave of progressive lawmakers who ran on shaking up the status quo. And just a few hours after being sworn in, Detroit Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib made that clear with a profanity-laced pledge to impeach President Trump that was caught on camera.
We're going to go in there, we're going to impeach them.
Those comments quickly overshadowed the carefully crafted message from Democratic leaders about their majority and legislative agenda for the year ahead. A number of Democrats criticized her statement as wrong and disrespectful, but Tlaib doubled down, tweeting Friday, "I will always speak truth to power, #unapologetically me." Impeachment is a divisive issue among Democrats. Party leaders are concerned that kind of talk could hurt their chances to retake the White House, but it's an issue that many of these progressive lawmakers aggressively campaigned on. Another freshman making waves is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's proposed a Green New Deal, which aims to tackle climate change and income inequality by generating 100% of the nation's power from renewable sources and eliminating all industrial greenhouse gas emissions and paying for it by raising taxes on the most wealthy to a rate of 60 to 70%. In an interview on CBS's 60 Minutes, Ocasio-Cortez said she welcomes the label of being radical.
I think that it only has ever been radicals that have changed this country. Abraham Lincoln made the radical decision to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. Franklin Delano Roosevelt made the radical decision to embark on establishing programs like Social Security. That is radical.
Republicans and President Trump lowered the top tax rate to 37%, so Ocasio-Cortez's plan would nearly double that. But her calls for a Green New Deal are being embraced by a number of mainstream Democrats as well, including several potential 2020 candidates, Senators Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker. So this isn't an issue that will be going away anytime soon. In Washington, I'm Garrett Tenney, Fox News.
All right, Garrett Tenney, thank you so much for that report. Eric.
Well, there was a final farewell to the California police officer who was killed in the line of duty. Funeral services held this afternoon for Corporal Ronell Singh. Authorities say he was shot to death during a routine traffic stop one day after Christmas by a man with a criminal record who was associated with the street gang living in our country illegally. Claudia Cowan, live in Modesto, California, with the heartbreaking details of an American hero. Hi, Claudia.
Hi, Eric. Just a tremendous outpouring of support for Corporal Singh's family, and I want to show you a very powerful moment that is unfolding right now behind me in front of the church in Modesto, where funeral services just wrapped up. You see hundreds and hundreds of law enforcement officers lining the street, preparing to salute Corporal Singh one more time as the hearse with his coffin makes its way by. And this is the culmination of a very powerful funeral where some of those who knew him best shared stories about the engaging young officers who grew up in Fiji and always wanted to become a cop, a man who touched so many lives. An overflow crowd of law enforcement from around the country heard about how Corporal Singh rose through the ranks and how hard he worked to improve his English and his driving skills. He apparently crashed a few patrol cars, which made people laugh. And what a great guy he was. In describing his older brother, Reggie Singh said that when they were growing up in Fiji, Ronell got hooked on the TV show Cops, and together they dreamed of coming to America.
People used to ask us, why America? Fiji is beautiful. Opportunity. For Ron's case, he wanted to be a law enforcement police officer in America. Why? USA has the best police officers. He wanted to do it in California, in America.
Ronell was the type of guy that you go out on a call with him and he just, when people say he always had a smile, that is so true. He would come up to you with a big smile and a handshake and always go out of his way to talk to you.
Newman Police Chief Randy Richardson said Singh even made people smile when he arrested them. The chief fought back tears as he told Singh's family that they are his family too, and that the entire department would always be there for them. Singh overcame many obstacles to become a police officer, and it was during a traffic stop the day after Christmas that he was killed by an illegal immigrant. In all, 8 people are behind bars facing charges ranging from murder to aiding and abetting. Now, as you can see, thousands of officers will line the street here. They'll be getting into their patrol cars and on motorcycles to escort the coffin from the church where the funeral was held today to the cemetery where Corporal Singh will be laid to rest in several hours. And I can tell you, Eric, all along the 7-mile procession route, even today in the rain, huge crowds have gathered to pay their last respects to Corporal Singh, who was just 33 years old. He leaves behind a wife, a 5-month-old son, and a heartbroken community. Back to you.
Quite a moving and emotional tribute to a legal immigrant who came to our country and achieved the American dream. Ronell Singh will not be forgotten. Claudia, thank you.
And new details emerging now about Paul Whelan, the American man held on espionage charges in Russia. Was his arrest part of a larger plan by the Kremlin? Plus, a possible change in plans for U.S. troops in Syria. Why President Trump's decision for a total withdrawal from the war-torn country might be not so total after all.
We want to protect the Kurds, but I don't want to be in Syria forever. It's sand, and it's death.
There's some new developments regarding the U.S. Marine veteran who has been detained in Moscow on suspicion of spying, so says the Kremlin. Russian officials dismissing suggestions that Paul Whelan's arrest was part of a broader plan for a possible prisoner swap involving Maria Butina, the Russian woman who pled guilty last month to acting as a foreign agent of Russia here in the U.S. Kitty Logan has more on this developing story from London. Hi, Kitty.
Hi, Eric. Well, today, the Russian Foreign Ministry says that Paul Whelan cannot even be considered for a prisoner swap yet because he has not yet been charged. But he is still in detention. He was detained in Moscow on December 28th. He's a 48-year-old U.S. citizen and works as an international security executive. His family say he is not a spy. Now, Whelan is being held at this prison in Moscow. It's notorious for harsh conditions. And some believe that Russia may want to use him at a later stage as a bargaining chip to release a Russian prisoner. Possibly, as you say, Marina Butina, who's being held in the U.S. and is charged with acting as a foreign agent. Although today, Russian authorities asked about another Russian citizen who they claim the U.S. is holding. Now, Russian authorities say Whelan will be formally charged in the near future with spying, but they have not given any specific details about these allegations. His family say Whelan was in Moscow privately on a 2-week trip to attend a wedding. Whelan had an extensive network of friends in Russia, many on social media. That has raised eyebrows. But some analysts say it's unlikely that Whelan could have been working for U.S. intelligence after a dishonorable discharge from the Marines in 2008. Now, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has asked Moscow to explain Whelan's detention. Meanwhile, the family are pressing hard for the U.S. government to campaign and to press for Whelan's release. But if he is charged and then convicted, he could be detained for up to 20 years, Eric.
Yeah, quite disturbing. Kitty, thank you. Laura?
There are new developments in the plan to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria. National Security Advisor John Bolton arriving in Israel today to discuss a post-exit strategy. He will then visit Turkey, which is reportedly asking the U.S. for aid in Syria. All of this coming as some U.S. troops could reportedly remain in the war-torn country after the planned withdrawal. A lot going on here in the region. Let's bring in Christian Whiten, former State Department senior advisor in the Trump and Bush administrations. Thanks for being here today and anxious to get your perspective on all of this. There's been a lot of back and forth about when exactly U.S. troops will be fully pulled out of Syria, right? The president abruptly announcing last month there could be a complete withdrawal. Now, National Security Advisor John Bolton, as mentioned, is visiting Israel and Turkey this weekend. There is word some U.S. troops will stay around. So what does all of this mean? How do you see it? And what does it mean for Israel?
I think the troops will be coming home a lot sooner than people think. There was a report that it might be 4 months, but then the president seemed to cast aspersions on that. There's this also report today that we may keep some there. I think that's actually a bad report. That's likely untrue. It comes from NBC News, which has very few contacts in the White House. It cites senior administration officials, but that could really be anyone. And there's an old Washington trick of leaking to the press that something is being discussed that you want to be discussed. I think we're seeing the national security establishment that really has no experience with ending wars. The last war we walked away from cleanly was in 1991, the Gulf War. So I think they're coming back. The Israelis, and this is something the neoconservatives try to obscure, the Israelis never asked us to intervene in Syria. That doesn't mean they weren't happy that we went in and cleaned up ISIS, but they're very careful not to ask that U.S. troops be put in harm's way because they sort of defend themselves a lot with our help, and they don't want to be on the hook for U.S. casualties. I think the discussion will be about broader security, about trying to perturb Iran's ability to resupply Hezbollah in Lebanon through Syria, which has been a problem really for decades, and other security issues. And then, of course, Bolton is on to Turkey to have similar discussions.
Right. And, I mentioned his robust schedule ahead of him in the coming days, talking with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu this weekend. And one of those key topics we were just talking about, discussing the mutual response to the threat from Iran, then going over to Turkey to speak with officials there about how to facilitate the U.S. withdrawal from Syria. So, what do you think Netanyahu may say to Mr. Bolton about his concerns on this?
My guess it's going to be a much broader conversation. Netanyahu himself is in an election campaign. He faces some political challenges, called a snap election, and so that's going on. But I think they're going to look more broadly at the Iran problem than just the issue of 2,000 troops in Syria. You know, Iran is in partnership with Assad, who has basically won the Syrian civil war. But you know, more broadly, we are causing problems for Iran. These are good problems that we are causing using sanctions, cutting off its ability to export oil. And if we want to cause problems for Iran, let's just do that directly, including by encouraging the dissent movement within Iran. So I would expect a broader strategic about the region rather than a complaint about the movement of 2,000 forces, and also a discussion about our robust abilities that remain in the region.
You know, I wanted to ask you about this Turkish request asking for the U.S. to provide substantial military support to help to continue to defeat ISIS. So I wanted to ask you what you think the U.S. government should do to help Turkey in this mission. You know, they've got a pretty long wish list: military support, transport, logistics. What do you think is reasonable and fair and really the right thing to do here?
I think the right thing to do is very little. We want to help Turkey, if there are remnants of ISIS, to provide them with intelligence, targeting, and that types of things. Turkey is an ally. It's not a very good ally. It's never been a particularly good ally to anyone if you look back through the 20th century. They've made a very long and very expensive wish list, such that, you know, it might be the first time a withdrawal actually ends up costing us more than it saves. You know, I think that should probably be rejected, and we should just, you know, cooperate with them minimally. We don't want to enable them necessarily to go and cause too many problems for the Kurds. We want them to cause problems for jihadists.
Christian, I'm sorry we've got to leave it there, but great to have your perspective. Christian Whiten, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Laura.
All right, Eric.
Well, the partial government shutdown, well, it is continuing now, entering its third week. And Democratic leaders, well, they refuse to budge on funding for the president's border wall, while he refuses to abandon that major campaign promise. We'll have the latest on the continuing gridlock coming up. Plus, well, Elizabeth Warren has hit the campaign stop. She's out on the campaign trail in Iowa. It's her first visit. Her message to voters in the Hawkeye State, we'll take a look straight ahead.
The only way that we're going to return this government to the people is if all of us are in this fight.
Well, it's day 15 of the partial government shutdown, and still no deal on the table despite another meeting this afternoon in Washington. Both President Trump and the Democrats digging in their heels over funding for the southern border wall. Democratic leaders signaling a little progress after they emerged from that meeting at the White House yesterday.
We recognize on the Democratic side that we really cannot resolve this until we open up government.
He made a plea to the president once again. Don't hold millions of Americans, hundreds of thousands of workers hostage. Open up the government and let's continue the discussions.
And yet another meeting broke up within the last hour with no result. Ellison Barber live in Washington with the latest. Hi, Ellison.
Hi, Eric. This week, the House passed a combined bill to reopen parts of the federal government through September 30th. 7 Republicans joined Democrats and voted in favor of that. The House also approved funding for DHS on an interim basis with no wall funding. The Senate is not expected to touch any of it. The top two leaders from the right and the left in the House and the Senate spent roughly 2 hours at the White House on Friday meeting with President Trump. Republicans described it as a productive meeting. Democrats described it as lengthy and at times contentious. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said Democratic leaders agreed to continue conversations with the White House, but she also said the border fight cannot be resolved until the government is open. Some Republicans, like Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, are talking about trying to combine border security, some sort of physical barrier at the border, with something that deals with immigrants currently protected under deferred action for childhood arrivals, the so-called Dreamers, and immigrants who have temporary protected status.
I'm probably a little bit more hawkish on this item than he is. But I can tell you this, he's made a number of overtures to his Democrat colleagues, and it's really a resounding wall on their part where they're just not responding.
At the same time, President Trump is saying he might go around everything and declare a national emergency in order to build the wall. The top Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee says not only is that a terrible and a reckless idea, but in his view, it is not legally justifiable.
In the case of a national emergency, the president can tap the Pentagon budget to meet that national emergency. But how you can describe what's going on our border right now, which is, other than the asylum seekers, our border is more secure with fewer people crossing illegally than have at any time in like the last 20 years. the courts should throw it out, should say this is not a national emergency, this is not legal.
Eric.
All right, Allison, thanks so much. Laura?
Well, Massachusetts Senator and likely Democratic presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren jumping into the 2020 fray with an appearance at the politically pivotal state of Iowa. The senator making her pitch to presidential primary voters of the Hawkeye State days after launching an exploratory committee to test the waters. Peter Doocy is in action. He's live in Des Moines with more on this. Hi, Peter.
Laura, this is the first chance that Iowa caucus goers have to size up Senator Warren, and it's also their first chance to ask her why exactly she thought it was a good idea to release DNA test results that showed she's just a fraction Native American.
My decision was, I'm just going to put it all out there. Took a while, but just put it all out there. All of my hiring records, including a DNA test, it's out there. I can't stop Donald Trump from what he's going to do. I can't stop him from hurling racial insults. What I can do is I can be in this fight for all of our families.
Warren has also been emphasizing in Iowa that taxpayer investment in her as a child was the only way that she, the daughter of a janitor, had opportunities to eventually become a college professor. And she's also been very careful to try to cast herself as a political outsider, reminding voters that she never held political office before she ran for the Senate in Massachusetts. But in Massachusetts, Fox News voter analysis finds that 62% of voters in her home state don't believe she would make a good president. And now the Republican Party of Iowa is piling on. Chairman Jeff Kaufman says this about her visit: Elizabeth Warren is just another East Coast liberal. She's proven to be an obstructionist who's long on rhetoric and short on accomplishments. The Massachusetts senator has spent more time whipping up an ancestry charade than she has talking about the issues Americans really care about: securing our borders, cutting taxes and regulations, and negotiating better deals with our trade partners. Because Warren is already so well known nationally, she has been enjoying crowds. She's been able to attract hundreds of people throughout the state already, but she's not the only well-known person, and it's not even really clear how far name recognition will get you in the 2020 Democratic primary. Laura.
All right, an interesting start to the new year for sure. Peter Doocy, thank you so much.
And for more on this, let's bring in Dave Brown. He's a former senior advisor and committee counsel to Senator Patty Murray, Democrat from Washington State, also Democratic strategist. And Brad Blakeman is here, former deputy assistant to President George W. Bush and a noted Republican himself. So, Brad, let me start with you. I mean, she's one of the biggest names. Seems to be the first out of the gate. The caucus is February 3rd next year. A lot of time. How does Senator Warren break out of the pack?
Well, so far, she really hasn't had a breakout moment, even with her announcement of an exploratory committee. Peter Doocy just told you about a Fox News poll which shows her amongst her own peers in Massachusetts. 62% of the people think that she would be a terrible president. The people who know you best are the people you're supposed to be serving. By the way, she's not serving them if she's in Iowa. But the first question I would ask as an Iowan to her is when is a farm bill not a farm bill, and when it is a loaded up food stamp bill. The Democrats have hijacked farmers in this country, and I think she has a lot to answer for.
You know, you just mentioned that poll. Let's show two polls. This is the first one. They asked constituents in the states which candidate they think would be the best president. Joe Biden, for example, in Delaware. Let's just take a look at Elizabeth Warren. You're right. She's right there at the bottom at 36% of Massachusetts voters said she would make a good president. And then at the same time, though, just take a look at what happened in Iowa. 65% of the likely caucus goers in Iowa see her as very or mostly favorable. So she's got a huge favorability rating in Iowa, David. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, Eric, I think she's got a really strong shot in Iowa. I think the issues that she's running on and that, frankly, her life in a way represents bringing life to the promise of the American dream. The fact that, you know, as Peter indicated in his intro to this segment, her dad was a janitor. He got sick He was able to find work. They were able to take advantage of the social safety net. It helped keep them afloat. America invested in Elizabeth Warren and her family, and now, a janitor raised a daughter who was a law professor and now a United States senator. So I think, she's running on kitchen table issues. Her entire point in this campaign is about making America work for everybody and being fair to everybody, and a promise of an equality of opportunity. So the American dream is actually something tangible for middle-class families. And so I think that Iowans, probably that's going to be a message that resonates with them. But look, polls indicate this is a really wide-open Democratic primary field. It's probably the most wide-open field we've had since 1992. And my takeaway at this point, a year out, is if everybody is as strong as Elizabeth Warren, who jumps into the race on the Democratic side, we are really well positioned to defeat Donald Trump in 2020.
What's so curious about what happened with the last election is a lot of the Obama voters switched over to President Trump, Brad. And do you think some of those same issues could resonate and they would switch back or switch over to Elizabeth Warren or a progressive Democrat?
I think once people reach the point of going into a voting booth, they're going to ask themselves, am I better off today than I was prior to Donald Trump? The answer is clearly yes. We're at 4% growth. We have full employment in our country. The stock market's up 30% since Trump took office. Unemployment amongst minorities is through the roof. We're bringing manufacturing back. A president runs on his record. I don't know how Elizabeth Warren or any Democrat is going to tell people with a straight face that they'll be better off under a Democrat. They simply won't. Regulations come back. The nanny state comes back. Democrats want you to send your money to the government instead of having more money in your pocket, which Donald Trump has done with tax cuts, to spend it the way you want to spend it. The fact of the matter is, the Democrats are going to have the same challenge Republicans did in 2016. 18 are going to run eventually, and we're going to have has-beens like Warren, we're going to have wannabes, and we're going to have newbies. And it's going to shake out probably with the most progressive candidate, which will not be able to defeat Donald Trump.
David, has-beens, wannabes, and newbies. What about that?
I mean, as always, Brad's great with the soundbite. Look, that analysis ignores one simple fact. Nancy Pelosi is now the Speaker of the House, and she's the Speaker of the House because Americans overwhelmingly in 2018 rejected this president's agenda, and Republicans, and elected a Democratic House majority. By the way, 38 of those new freshmen are women. They account for over 60% of the seats we flipped. So this is very much, 2018, very much the year of the woman. I think people like Senator Elizabeth Warren, who are masterful as senators, are going to be very strong candidates. But I would agree with Brett on this point, which is I hope, and I'm not naive here, so I understand the reality, but I hope that this election can be about issues. I would love for us to have a debate where Donald Trump is measured on his record, where Elizabeth Warren is measured on her record, where the candidates are evaluated on their vision for this country, for our future, and we actually delve into policy as opposed to just playing a process game, because I think as voters, we're far worse off if that's the case.
And Brad, quickly, looking forward to that too?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's going to be a slugfest, must-see TV with Democrats knocking the junk out of themselves to take the mantle of who's going to be the most socialist amongst that group.
Let's go back for a second, look at a live video of Senator Warren in Des Moines. So just when you thought that the campaign of 2020 cannot start early enough, it's what, the 4th, what day's today?
It's the 5th.
The 5th, yeah. 5 days into the new year, and we're live in Iowa with the race. Brad and Dave, stay tuned. Thanks so much. Of course.
Thanks, Eric.
Laura?
A sad story here. Gunfire erupts at a bowling alley, leaving at least 3 people dead. What police are saying about the shooting as the investigation unfolds.